On October 9th, 2009, Dr. Dianne Gereluk, formerly a senior lecturer at the School of Education in Roehampton in London, joined us as our special weekend presenter on an issue of social justice. Dr. Gereluk focused on cultural identity, and most specifically, the issues and the aims of this seminar focused on cultural and religious identity clash at the school gates. Unfortunately, we did not have audio for the first part of her presentation, but we did catch it for her conclusion and discussion with our learners, and this hopefully will be well worth your time and attention.
About the people in which we live in the same society. I've talked about the neutral space in the earlier, so I'm not going to talk about that, but I just think it's just ridiculous for 100 reasons why schools are not neutral spaces, both in the hidden and informal curriculum and the way we structure our schools. So I think, even if we ban it, I think it's superficial. I think if we're hoping for individuals to, be exposed to, critical debates, we need to allow for symbolic clothing to be in schools, particularly if it does raise questions or concerns among, the mainstream society. We found, the segregation elements of the 1950s and, up until the 1960s and 70s, and even today, informally, you still have it in the United States. We need to create a debate about that in contemporary, in schools, and trying to kind of skim over it because it's difficult or controversial seems to be the wrong way to go. If people find certain political statements problematic, well, we should be having a debate about it. Not kind of covering it up. So that, in one of the chapter I sent you, I talked about the Day of Silence protest that shows students who want to be in support or to raise awareness to bullying for those people who have different sexual orientations. Well, that's a debate that should be occurring in the schools, not pushing it away because it's problematic or it's going to be a bugger to teach. We need to have that debate in schools, and we have to have that discourse if we're going to talk about a political society. Well, let's say you're on the other side, say no, we need to allow as much freedom in terms of symbolic clothing in schools, and so we have this debate. Well, especially in North America, for the vast majority of the cases, students, the only kind of symbolic clothing they're doing is their love of Nike and love of fashion and the latest trends. And so you part be saying, listen, if we're talking about making informed judgments, maybe all this consumerism is getting in the way of them actually focusing on the real issues and talking about critical debate. So maybe we should have a uniform policy. Maybe we should have very strong dress codes that don't adhere to low jeans, that you can see your underwear and ripped jeans and all this other things that distract our students from kind of the real issues and the real debates. In most cases, our problem with autonomy is not kids expressing themselves, is that they've focused on the expression of their clothing to the exclusion of actually real critical debates that are happening in schools. Let's remove that ridiculous kind of distracting element of this consumerism so we can get to the real heart of the debates. And frankly, maybe those 8 hours where they're not distracted by symbolic clothing, they can express themselves when they go home. They can wear their T-shirts, they can wear whatever they want outside, they can do their protests, whatever they want, but not in the school walls. Let's focus on other issues. And frankly, there are more effective ways to teach about autonomy, about making, other than one's clothing. Okay. We're last couple slides and then we're finished here. Well, I think there's something about the autonomy. We have to make informed judgments, and I don't believe in the consumerism. I wish that was reduced. I don't think we should ban it because I don't think that works because I think it causes resistance with children, and in many cases it forces families to take more extreme measures in terms of taking their children out. I want children to rub up against other children that are not of their faith. I say to my husband and I are atheists. I want my child to be with religious children. So, because no matter how much I, don't believe in God, I want my child to have that ability to make their choice about God, to understand the values and the beliefs and the commitment that I can understand theoretically, but don't appreciate the depth. So I want my child to be exposed and to participate in debate about it. I want, to have this issue. I want it to be upfront in a school. So I think in that way, I always lean towards more symbolic clothing in schools rather than less. And so I think when we look at, and that happens in terms of civic considerations, instead of skimming over issues, if we're thinking about politically active, making them into politically active citizens, we need to be, engaging in these debates, not at a passive theoretical level, but in real pressing, meaningful issues that are relevant to children, that are timely. And, my sense is, it's a conjecture, but I think my conjecture is I think it's bang on, frankly. I say that humbly, right? My sense is that and controversial elements, aspects of homosexuality, religion, politics, terrorism, extremism, all of these things that are so timely in our debate. And if we want them to be active, politically engaged citizens, we need to be jumping into this debate and letting children talk and facilitating it in a way that's meaningful for them, that moves us towards some kind of reconciliation and some reciprocal relationships in a political society. We don't need to be shying away. And yes, it's hard to teach and it's difficult, and we get into issues of policy and pedagogy. But on a kind of a philosophical principles, these are the aims that we need to be pursuing, not shying away from, which has definitely happened in the United States, where this kind of this social cohesion and collectiveness to the exclusion of kind of any kind of critical debates, because it's just too tough to discuss. Now, I don't think anything goes in schools. I don't think we should allow for everything. And this is this is always the fun part of the debate, is whether these help in any way or not. Okay, the first consideration, things that I think we should ban. Does the clothing create significant health and safety concerns? Is it a detriment to that particular student if they were to wear that clothing, or to other students? There are very few cases that I think symbolic clothing creates significant health and safety concerns. You might say perhaps the jilbab, which is a large, overgarment for Muslim girls, might create a significant health, particularly in science classes. But in many cases, there's small adjustments that can be made in terms of the clothing. The hijab or the yarmulke, because they wear safety pins or pins in their head, might be considered this is used often in physical education classes. Well, no, they figured it out, these faith groups, and there are ways in which to make small adjustments in terms of it. The only one that I really see as being a problem that I have yet to be convinced that shouldn't be banned is niqab, where it's a Muslim dress where it only covers the eyes. I think there's some significant kind of health and safety concerns, and it inhibits the educational aims of that child and for others in terms of the enunciation of one's voice for English classes, in terms of the social skills. So I've yet to be have anyone change my opinion of the niqab. I think that one probably doesn't fit this. I think there's significant health and safety risks. I think it inhibits the educational aims for that student and for others. Is the clothing oppressive to oneself or to others? I think the offensive principle has gone way overboard, so I don't think that's very helpful. But is it oppressive to oneself or to others? So the Confederate flag, racist symbols. I put the bikini-clad girls in here because I think it's oppressive to the girls and to others. If you've read the chapter, I make an example in terms of the Day of Silence protest. And this one, I've read it, and I think I've changed my mind on. I keep on, jumping back on each side of the fence on this one. What's interesting about the Day of Silence, there's been a number of students who wear symbolic clothing or tape their mouth to show their support of gay rights and bullying in terms of sexual orientation. There have been a number of students who've been doing counter-protest T-shirts saying, love the sinner, hate the sin, and various kind of counter-protests against the Day of Silence. And so I kind of waver, saying, should we just ban this event because it's so disruptive? Is the counter-protest T-shirts oppressive to that group who is trying to make a political statement, or should we be allowing that in terms of the critical debate that needs to be occurring in schools and education more generally? And it'd be interesting if people want to take that one up. And I keep on flipping in terms of whether I think I should. I want the event to go on, so I stand on that one. I think the event should go. I think schools have to deal with it. This is a pressing issue, and it's timely, and there's problems in our society about homosexuality in terms of the way in which the violence that's being had to those people. Should we allow the counter-protest? I keep on wavering. I think if it's explicit in terms of the T-shirt that's oppressive to that other group, to the group in support of it, I think that's obvious. You say, no, we don't want oppressive symbols. It's vulgar, oppressive. If it's a political statement, now I'm kind of hedging back, saying, well, it's a political statement. Maybe what we need to do is create a sound, formal debate in which to raise it. Again, schools need to be sensitive to this issue. We can't allow it just to have these kind of these factioning, divisive sides in the school grounds. We need to do this then formally, if this is such a contentious issue, in the formal curriculum and in some kind of manner in which to develop a debate and raise kind of the burdens in terms of the two very emotional sides to this debate, and try to kind of facilitate it. And how do we reconcile with people that we don't have very, very strong disagreements with one another? So again, it's another educative opportunity for these students. And the final one, does this clothing significantly inhibit the educational aims of the school? So the very disruptive nature of something that would inhibit the educational aims, things that will cause race riots, that has shown in the past to cause problems between ethnic groups or cultural groups, that is going to cause such strife in a school. Well, educational aims come first, but we need to let's use that with a very kind of cautious approach, I would say. So that's where I stand here. So this is my book. There you go, which is selling well in Europe because everyone's angry about this. But that's where I stand. I'm curious now to see where everyone else is in terms of this debate and where you might like to take this up.
Let's have a round of applause because I think your presentation was brilliant. So thank you for that. Bravo.
Bravo. Thank you.
Wow. You've packed a lot in the first hour. Let's open it up. We've got people in PK-12. We've got people in higher education. So we should have a lot of discussion on this.
Good.
I see Lisa has her hand up. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, Diane. My name's Lisa. I work at the University of Colorado, Denver. And I just have a question for you. As they write these policies about ostentatious religious symbols, how do they define ostentatious?
Lisa, I'm having a little bit hard time hearing you. Can you I caught about that you worked at the University of Colorado and policies on religious symbols, and then I lost you there.
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, quickly, how are they defining ostentatious when they set up these policies?
Oh, yeah. My sense is very poorly, and it's been inconsistently applied in schools. And some schools are still turning a blind eye to some of the religious symbols, given their multicultural demographics. My sense is, from the various kind of cases in the media portrayal and when I've been presenting in France, anything that basically can be hid under a shirt is okay. So, like if you have a necklace that has some kind of expression, so a crucifix, a Star of David, something small that can be, not in your face. But many of the Jewish, so they're hitting a lot of the kind of non-Christian face, frankly. So that turbans, hijab, skull caps are all coming are the key targeted religions.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Dennis, go ahead.
Hi, Diane. My name is Dennis Tartikel. This topic of symbolic clothing is certainly current and very timely. I'd even suggest that you've definitely bitten off a challenging subject matter. My questions are, number one, how, when, and why did you tackle this matter of symbolic clothing? And two, where do you think that it begins, or where does it end? School, public, because they are interrelated.
Okay. Well, how did I start? It was more. It was under kind of my broader interest in terms of the promotion of community. So I'm going to talk about this in great detail tomorrow with Constance's doctoral seminar. But my concern was there's huge rhetoric about community generally in schools, and everyone says, "Oh, this is great. The communities are wonderful." And so we need to promote them. But there's no kind of the ambiguity and the rhetorical, the buzzword, the buzz around communities made me kind of cautious, knowing that there's many types of communities that are actually disenabling and disenfranchising and marginalizing. So when I was trying to articulate what are the principles that we think are important to promote in the promotion of community, I started thinking, well, there are certain practices in community that I find abhorrent, frankly, and I don't think we should promote in schools. I don't think that's one of the aims of schools. And then I thought, well, if we're talking about practices in communities, and I'm a believer that there's some benefits to community, the aspect of promoting communities. Where does symbolic clothing lie in this, in terms of the practices that people bring to their communities and the physical gestures and towards of communities, towards schools? And what was interesting was while this was happening, while I was kind of getting my head around this notion of community, was kind of this debate that was happening, and particularly in France, and with in the early 90s, kind of part of the problem with France is they have this huge influx of Muslim immigrants, particularly from Algeria, coming into France, and like the ethnographic studies and kind of the empirical work that's been done in France makes a strong case that it's a very traditional, very kind of racist undertones in the French society, where equality, liberty, and fraternity are kind of on the shelf. It's kind of superficial in many respects. So for a basic example is, no matter if you're born in France or if you've immigrated to France or you've become a French citizen, you're always, your label in French is always foreigner. There's no kind of abbreviated nature of being a French, African, or it's kind of just like you're French or you're foreigner. And so like these kind of implicit ways in which the language and semantics are used, and the ways in which, the discriminatory policies is very, lots of empirical studies show that if you have a Muslim surname, you will never get an interview. It's very difficult to get an interview in France. And so there's kind of like systematic discrimination happening in schools. So while this kind of current debate happens, there's this move towards the French legislation. And so people are rallying behind it because saying we need to, stop the oppression of these adolescent Muslim girls. We need to stop, we need to kind of build up the civic republican ideals because we have this huge, segregated society where Muslim communities are in these kind of, in the arrondissements, like the small little suburbs, in these kind of ghettos, these Muslim ghettos. And so this is happening. In the meantime, England's having the same problems. Here we have this very, very entrenched uniform, policy that's been there for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden these students are saying, well, yeah, but it doesn't accommodate me. Here we've got a nice, Christian, we have either a skirt and dress for the girls and trousers for the boys. So what happens to the Jewish kids? What happens to the Sikh kids? So you just take them off when we wear the uniform policy? So some schools have kind of accommodated. So within the uniform policy, they can put their school logo onto various kind of clothing, the matching school colors to accommodate. Other schools saying, forget it, we're not going to do it. And what happens is you have this kind of, again, the insipid ways that we then segregate students, because many of the parents saying, the heck with it, I'm not going to send my child to the school because here I am. It's a bugger to get into the school in the first place. And the first thing I'm going to do is challenge the uniform policy, and I'm going to have to make a big stink about it to do it. So parents say, listen, I can't be bothered with this school. I'm going to go down to another school, to the next neighborhood. And so what you find is the hidden forms of exclusion that are happening in England because they're not accommodating uniforms to meet for the diversity of the student, the population. In schools say, we have an established uniform policy. If you don't like it, go to that school. And so it excludes many families and many communities from certain schools in terms of the stringency on the uniform policies. And so there's these elements of inequality and social justice issues that that are masked by these kind of superficial aspects of the symbolic clothing. So that was the first question. The second one, Dennis, because I've already now given a rant there about that, how I came to it. The second question was, where do we go from here, was it? Where's Dennis?
Where does it begin? Where does it end? School with public?
I'm having a real hard time. My volume is so low for some reason. But Dennis, can you just speak up a little bit?
Where does it end? Because school and public are interrelated. So.
Well, yeah, that's like the $1,000,000 question. Where does it end? Well, in terms of North America, I think it's easier, especially if we don't have uniform policies. We've made kind of a conscious decision as societies not to set up uniform policies, and there's a pendulum swinging, a movement towards uniform policies, and I have some sympathy with it. But because we've chosen dress code policies instead of uniform policies, we've there's an implicit understanding then that we believe in towards kind of freedom of expression, freedom of association, equal inclusion, that we allow people's diversity to come into schools. I tread on you should have, more allowances in schools. And the aspect of teachers to guide. Now, within my parameters of saying, listen, it can't be, oppressive. It can't inhibit the educational and safety aims. Oppressive, in a lot of respects covers a lot of the vulgarity and offensive nature of some of the teachers that are out there. Things that are oppressive. In many regards, the vulgarity slips into kind of oppressive elements. So making that distinction, what is oppressive? Is it going to inhibit? Does it systematically kind of downplay or inhibit a certain or marginalize a certain group or a certain behavior that is inhibiting to students' development? But I at this point, I'm on the side of let's provide more leeway and let's create it. Use this then as an educative opportunity for schools to have a debate rather than shying away from it.
Dianne, we have Jan Tyler to ask a question.
Hi, Dianne. Thank you for speaking with us today. Can you hear me okay?
I can. You're the best one so far. Excellent.
Okay. I live in Indiana, and the city in which I live this fall just added a dress code and caused quite a community uproar. And part of me wishes I would have had these articles to forward to the school superintendent to just give a different perspective. I think what's really difficult is it became this huge debate and public uproar over splitting hairs over the fact that children can't wear stripes or prints. I understand gang wear. I understand some of the other things and nicer clothing as far as no holes in the jeans and et cetera. It became a community uproar over, there wasn't even any influence on retail buyers because we would go to shop for children for school and can't find plain shirts. Yeah. So it became this huge debate between consumerism and rules as rules because we said they're here, and do children in special education really need to follow a dress code, or are we going to have autistic 9-year-old gangbangers, which, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but I do have a 9-year-old with autism. So there were protests outside of the school and all sorts of things. So as a learner in this type of program, there's the community activist in me who wants to try to educate the school board in a sense on these bigger issues. So I guess my long-winded question is, how do we as learners in this environment and then as community citizens help inform our school board leaders of some of these bigger picture issues that I really think they're missing? What would your advice be to parents like us?
Well, yeah, I'll provide conjectures. I'm a good philosopher, and I'm less of a policy analyst, but we're gonna go there in that direction because I think I'm hoping that my philosophical arguments will influence policy, and that's the hope and the aim. in terms of the kind of the fervor in terms of we need to kind of create. There's lots of here. I'll start again. There's a lot of anecdotal conjectures, particularly in the United States, about a correlation between dress code policies and student achievement. For instance, uniform policies create more cohesion. Better stringent dress codes. There's a correlation with higher student achievement because kids are not focusing. Parents and teachers find that there's less disruption in classes if there's a stricter dress code. And there's kind of all this kind of sympathetic anecdotal evidence. There's a very good study by Brunswa. I'm just looking over at my book to see if I've got the book. I'm going to look here. This is the joys of this. Yeah, Brunswa, the school uniform movement and what it tells us about American education, a symbolic crusade. He did a longitudinal study, empirical study, over the last 10 years in the United States, and he says there's been, there's a real kind of pendulum swing towards really enforced dress codes, and towards uniform policies in the United States. And yet, when you look at the empirical evidence to show for this, there's very little in terms of any correlation between better student cohesion, in terms of improved student achievement. It's just more kind of the anecdotal whims of teachers saying, "Oh, it'd be so nice just not to have to worry about this," and parents saying, "Oh, I just want my child not to be wearing ripped jeans and to school and worrying about this." Now, there's other reasons why we might want to have a dress code or uniform policy, but that doesn't seem to be the reason to provide. Maybe someone else in this group can provide more of the policy. I would just say is you start bringing up, raising the questions, saying, what is the purpose of dress code policies? Where do we draw the line in terms of it? Are we missing out in a debate by excluding it? So things that are controversial in nature, like the Day of Silence protest, or talking about racial divides. If we're talking about social justice issues and talking about education, about making them develop skills and habits in which to deliberate in a political society, you don't hide these issues. You bring them to the fore. So I think when we have these public forums and these debates, or writing letters to the editor into the newspapers, like there's ways in which we do it informal, both at a school when they have parent, public forums where you can talk about this and saying we're instituting a dress code policy and saying, well, perhaps what we need to do is consider whether it's oppressive. That seems to be reasonable. What can we think about it in this way instead of oppressive things seems to be automatically. Is it sending a political message? Well, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe as a parent, I want to, perhaps we should allow political, and maybe our job is then to have public forums or public debates or formal, days devoted to these controversial issues instead of skirting around. So I think you do it in various strategies as a parent and as an educator. You bring it up in your school mandates. You bring it up in public forums. You write letters to the newspaper. You highlight aspects and you bring it to the fore. There's numerous ways, both formally and informally. But sadly, that's not my strength. My strength is to provide the principles and the groundwork, and hopefully others will take my lead and move forward into some kind of policy and pedagogy elements. So Dianne, that's the best I can do, Jan.
Thanks.
Dianne, this is Constance. I can see that the 3 questions I have will never be asked because we have so many people wanting to ask questions. Maxine is next.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your insight with us. I'm an urban school principal, and I strongly support a uniform policy for reasons that to me are real. We have students who have been killed, students who have been attacked, students who have perhaps lost some limbs because those uncaring individuals choose to violate their individual rights for wearing those Nike jeans or those jackets that cost $500. Every morning in my urban school, we check to see if students have on their uniforms. That's the board policy. However, because the board can't afford to pay for them, we cannot deny a student an education. But I see the difference in behavior when my boys and my girls have their uniforms on and they are neatly tucked into their pants. It decreases the amount of distractions. It decreases the number of unethicals or school violations. It decreases the number of fights in the building, and therefore, with that being said, all of those things add more time to the education of children. My husband is a principal of a charter school. This is my last comment. I'll be quiet. My husband is a principal of a charter school, and some of his partners purchased uniforms for some girls who were being mentored. And the young ladies could choose the type of uniform that they could buy. One student chose the striped checkered skirt and the blue top. And she said, quote, "That makes me look smart." So there is some kind of association, even from my perspective, of passing by a school where everybody is in uniform. That, to me, is what I like to see. And I'll stop right there. But I strongly support uniforms. If you visit Africa, for example, even the poorest countries, those students come to school in uniform, and that to me makes a statement.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I sympathize with you, Maxine, here, and in my, I don't do it in either the chapter that I sent you, but in my book I actually talk about uniform policies a fair bit. I actually don't disagree with uniform policies. You have to kind of step back. If we agree to dress code policies, I actually think there should be a lot of latitude given. And for the majority of schools in Canada and the United States, we don't have a uniform policy. And because we've taken that as our starting point, if you give the latitude for dress code policy, or if you stand by having dress codes with basic kind of requirements, not much more, no uniform policy. Dress codes, what cannot be worn, as opposed to uniform policy, what must be worn to schools, right? So there's a distinction. What cannot be worn at schools, the dress code policies will state what cannot be worn, as opposed to uniform policies, which is what must be worn to schools. If you have a dress code policy, so what cannot be worn, a list of things that are unacceptable to the school, then I think a lot of latitude be given to that in terms of, because of freedom of expression and freedom of association, freedom of religion. And freedom of free speech. All of these things play into that because we've taken that stance as kind of our a priori stance. This is where we're starting from, so I think lots of latitude. If you start from the position of a uniform policy, it's different. And I think there are valuable and competing values that I think are not equally, but at least arguably just as valuable, if not more valuable. So if I actually am in favor of uniform policies for some of the reasons that you stated, Maxine, in terms of less distraction, in terms of the economic discrepancies between those with the have and have-nots, in terms of collective ethos. So I think these are desirable values to have in schools as well. But it's a uniform policy, what must be worn at schools. If you take the stance, which England has, and I like England's stance on uniform policies, I actually would hope that Canada moved in that direction, and I'm glad that your school did that, because I think it does alleviate some of these other problems. Then I have a fourth criteria, which I didn't talk about because I was talking to American context, but there's a fourth criteria, which has caused lots of debate, and maybe you'll be curious. I think a uniform policy is fine because I think it promotes other desirable values and aims in schools and it might help in terms of reducing some of the friction that often happens with clothing. It must be accommodating to those faith groups if it's essential to their identity. Now, the thorny bit is what do we constitute as essential or constitutive of that self? And what's been happening is using legal precedents. It tends to favor religious identities and to the exclusion of political and social identities. So religious groups, particularly those of more fundamentalist natures or orthodox religions, can usually show with great ease the essential aspect of their symbolic clothing. So it's an essential part of my identity. This is who I am. And then I think then in the obligation of the schools, then as a principal, I would hope that you would say either in your mission in your mandate, or if you had like an alternative, depending on your student demographics, saying we need to have certain accommodations for essential clothing. So making sure there's a school logo that has or maybe if you have a number of Muslim girls in your population, saying, okay, our school colors are purple and yellow, that they can choose between a purple and yellow hijab. Included with their modest dress, things like that would allow for it, so that parents don't. The first thing they have to do is challenge you to say, "Here's a uniform policy, and it goes greatly against my debate." I'm going to say I'll tell you the problems, and I've given this argument out, this recommendation, this principle out for those who have uniform policies. And I don't know how to reconcile it, and it comes up in different ways. But there's a common one in England. A girl tried to wear the chastity ring that shows her virginity, and she said, "This is an essential part of my identity. I don't want to have sex until I'm married. It's a physical symbol." And the school expelled her because it wasn't part of the established uniform policy, and she lost the case. Now, there's lots of cases where it's easy for those for fundamentalist religions to show that it's an essential part of their identity. It's harder for me to reconcile saying there's a girl who's 14 and she's goth and she says it's an essential part of her identity. As a school, I have a harder time. Like, at what point do we say, is it essential, or is it just them going through a phase or through a trend? So making that distinction. So it's very easy for religious symbolic clothing to make accommodations. Does that mean then we have to make accommodations to someone who's Greenpeace, who are such political activists, and they say this is a strong part of this is part of me. I am a Greenpeace activist. I need to wear my symbolic clothing. I need to wear something, an indicator, a pin, as part of my uniform policy. To what extent do we have that kind of? Do we start accommodating for these kind of other what these children or these adolescents deem to be essential to part of their identity? Where do we draw the line? So it works really well for religious identity and making accommodations. It's really tricky when you start thinking about other political or social symbols that we deem to be. Rastafarian hair has come up in England all the time, where people say it's an essential part of my identity, and the principal's or the headmaster says, no, it's just because you really want to smoke marijuana and you like the social lifestyle. So then you have a debate of, are they really part of the faith group? Is it a part of the essential part of their identity? Are they just trying to get past the system so that they can, show their lifestyle, their social lifestyle? So.
Thank you.
Love is the next questioner.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Dianne, Dr. Gereluk, what should I call you? Dianne?
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of time, but I can hear you a little bit.
Is that better?
It is. Thanks, George.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I don't have a problem with debate. And I applaud you in your attempts to come up with what is permissible, because it's so different for every country, every culture. But my question is, if you are saying, okay, let's encourage debate, have you given consideration to how to prepare schools, universities, for those debates that they will have to become involved?
Yeah, my short answer is not as yet, but that's my next book. I need to, because that's where it becomes difficult. Is how do you put this into practice? In what ways do we make things sensitive? And there's been lots of controversial issues in England. It's bizarrely they turn a blind eye to bullying, for instance. And so there's a lot of physical violence that happen on the school grounds, partly because there's so many accountability measures in England. They don't want to have any negative media attention, so they try to hide it rather than deal with it in England British schools. And so what they've done is they've put in these teaching packs about bullying, for example, and they say, what we need to do is just facilitate an open discussion. Well, no, that doesn't seem right. We need to provide moral guidance in terms of some of the negative aspects about bullying, and teachers provide not just a forum saying anything goes and let just the kids kind of chat about it. This kind of, caring, sharing environment, which just kind of seems ridiculous, like this ambiguous. There's a moral element to this that we need to develop, an ethical debate that underpins, issues of bullying. And I think that's similar to some of the issues that are raised, and you'd have to kind of go by the subject-specific aspect in terms of what's practiced. So the day of silence. Having an open debate, I think, might just facilitate more divisiveness. I think you need to kind of develop in the political elements in terms of what happens as individuals if we come to both reasonable arguments and principles, but come to irreconcilable differences. How do we then cope then as living together in a school and in a society when there are many issues where we just come to irreconcilable differences between Republicans and Democrats in terms religious and non-religious, in terms of homosexuals and heterosexuals. I think this. Literally, I just sent in a book proposal saying, so my next task is to say, how do we actually do this? How do we bring up controversial topics into the school in a careful and sensitive way that not only just facilitates open discussion, because I think that's dangerous and superficial because it can lead in ways you don't want to, provide that facilitative nature, but also in terms of providing a moral and political component in terms of how do we deliberate when there are these emotionally charged issues in our society? How do we come to agree to disagree? How do we then debate learning the rules of proper debate that is not hostile, so it doesn't lead into something more violent or explosive on the school grounds? So the answer is no, I have not dealt with that. But the answer is, am I dealing with it? Yeah, talk to me next year. This is the answer.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dianne. Christy, you're next.
Hi, Dianne. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Great.
Thanks for talking with us today.
You're welcome.
I'm kind of more on the side of leniency. Isn't it blatantly discriminatory to not allow people to wear their religious headpieces? And I mean, doesn't it not create kind of fear of the other in the other kids when they see the school saying, no, you can't wear this, you have to leave school because it's wrong? I mean, isn't that kind of counterproductive?
Yeah, well, if you have, so go back, I'm going to bring Maxine since she's got a uniform policy. If you have a dress code policy, I completely agree with you, Christy. There are very few exceptions where I think that I would want to ban certain symbolic clothing, except those that are just so, oppressive. Like, I have no problems, banning T-shirts with KKK on it, with Confederate flags on it, kill the gay, like all these kind of, these hateful messages, right? There's all these kind of hateful messages out there. That seems completely appropriate for schools to ban it. I think what we need to do is address, part of that critical debate is addressing fears of the other and the differences between communities and groups and associations. And we don't do that by hiding it. And that's the way, in many respects, France has done that. They've taken a really drastic stance, and I think it's having incredible repercussions. And they had, the race riots of 2006 during September and October is indicative of that. The fact that the legislation in 2004 did not help it, it's exacerbated. And in terms of it's masking what's underpinning the inequalities in that society and the fear and the discrimination between many of the Muslim communities and the kind of the more what I would call mainstream kind of Christian Judaic religions in France. So yeah, I'm with you there. I want that debate to happen. I want to have a sense of comfortable. I have a 4-year-old daughter. I want her to see this. She's like, why is she wearing a hijab? Well, that's part of it. I want that conversation to happen. Instead of it going, I'm going to find the happy little gated community with my white Caucasian upper middle class families. I don't want that. I try to find the school that's the most heterogeneous. I want her to be, frankly, I want her to be with lots of religious people. I want her to be with different ethnic minorities. Like this is something I want her to feel comfortable. She's 4. She asks innocent, honest questions. I want her to, I want to engage in that. And part of that is I don't want it to be, pushed underneath the school. And her, she goes to this to a school called the French and International School. So it teaches French immersion, and it has a uniform policy, Maxine, just so you know. And what's interesting is they don't have any accommodation for any other religious dress. And I'm going, well, why not? Like so as a parent, who was asking me about the parent? Jan, was it? Yeah. So as a parent, I'm going to the principal, going, what happens? Have you ever had any Muslim parents try to apply? Oh, you don't have a big Muslim population. Why is that? Oh, and you start saying, well, maybe, it might not be an issue because they can't be bothered to apply. They'll just go to the Muslim charter school down the road because they can't be bothered to deal with the very first days, go and get you registered and then deal with the uniform policy. Like, so in that ways, it's very limiting. So I'm with you there. Like, I like uniform policies, but it better be accommodating. Right. And if you don't have it, then the dress code should have plenty of latitude.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jorge.
Oh. Hi. Hello,
Hi. You're cutting in and out a little bit, but we'll see if it goes. Let's try another sentence or two.
Okay, let me bring the speaker a little closer. How's that?
Excellent.
No, I wanted to mention because years ago, before I was in education, we were pushing the uniform policies down here. I'm in Miami, Florida. Okay. And a lot of when you talked about the research, they had quoted a lot of research that said, well, uniform schools tend to do better than schools without uniform policies. And then I wasn't in education yet, but I went ahead and looked into the schools they were citing. It turns out most of them were charter military schools, private single gender schools. I mean, there was a whole lot of different variables that could account for those schools doing better. I wasn't I'm not a big uniform fan.
Yeah.
That was kind of, what's the
okay. Well, I agree. Like, I think there are good reasons to have uniforms, but the reasons that are often cited in terms of improved student achievement, it's going to reduce the inequities between between the haves and have-nots. That's clear. But in England, because they've had it for 100 years, and you ask people, and there's lots of empirical sites. There are lots of subtle ways that tell a difference between the economic between upper and middle and lower class individuals, even with uniform policies. So it's going to reduce it. It's not going to eliminate the economic indicators. So whether a parent buys a uniform that's secondhand or buys a uniform that's going to be very big so the child can wear it for 2 years, or there's subtle indicators between groups that happen in uniform policies, such as the how short can you make if you have a skirt for a child, how short can you make the skirt without breaking the school uniform policy. So there's how high are your knee socks or not your knee socks. So there are lots of subtle indicators, and children are savvy to make these little rules, informal rules amongst themselves in which to deal with it. Does it reduce economic, inequalities? Yes, it does. Does it eliminate it? Of course not. Does it develop social, collective ethos? Yes, to a degree. But it's coupled with other much more bigger, broader issues in a school than just clothing. Clothing is not the panacea or the Pandora's box. It's one small element which contributes or doesn't contribute. Does it improve student achievement? It's a superficial element coupled with, then the ethos of a commitment. What they don't do is all the other variables in terms of the commitment of the parents, the demographics of the school, of who's sending their child to the school, the strength of the principal, and not like there's hundreds of reasons. So, you can't put too much into clothing. And I think people want this as to be if we could only figure out dress code policies or uniform policies, whether we should have it or not, our schools would be so much better. No, like it's a small element in a larger debate amongst social justice issues of how to kind of reduce inequalities in schools. It's an interesting one, and it's important because especially for those who find their symbolic clothing essential. But it's not the panacea. Like, this is not, as much as I'd love this to be my 30-year work, it's not going to be. It's a part of a piece of the puzzle to larger, broader social justice issues, right? Of which this is a small element. So schools and school boards and school districts that rally around symbolic clothing, saying we need strong dress codes, or we need uniform policies, or we don't because it does this, and this. Well, no, get realistic. It's going to help in subtle ways in this way, but it's not. We have to address larger underpinning issues that are problematic in our society if you really want to get to the root of it.
Well, that was kind of a question I had. The other one's just a statement. That was kind of the question I had when you speak of collective ethics. My question is, whose collective ethics and ethics?
Yeah, well, that's great, right? That's a good kind of. That's a good critique of feminist ethics and postmodern ethics and critical Marxists, and say what is the common good, and of course and historically uniform policy is often segregated towards a common good of what was the dominant discourse of society. So that's the challenging. You can talk about some of the benefits and values of a uniform policy towards the collective ethos, but then you have again the broader issues: what is the common good? Is that a collective ethos worth imbuing? Is that something you want to develop? Is it making them into docile? You can go into various tracks. The feminist roots would say, listen, it's privileging the dominant groups to the exclusion of minorities. And postmoderns say, is it making them to docile individuals? We all have this. Every kind of, depending on whatever paradigm or discipline of tradition you have, we all have these kind of concerns of, who are those who are going to be, who is excluded when we think about collective ethos, and is that something, to what extent do we want a collective ethos? And again, I don't know if you're in the doctoral seminar, but that's kind of the tensions that I'll talk about tomorrow between kind of collective ethos in the promotion of community, and to the extent of the detriment of individual rights, and those particularly who are dependent or disadvantaged, right? So it's trying to reconcile between community ideals, between kind of the individual concern, the concerns of the individuals, particularly those who are disadvantaged. So yeah. And I got to tell you, there's a my research is so easy because people just send me media clippings constantly for the last 10 years. So my research usually just gets handed to me on a plate. But I had another colleague from Florida who sent me something, and there's a school there who, bizarrely, when you go into detention, or if you don't wear the dress code, so if you don't conform to the dress code, this is what it was. If you don't conform to the dress code, so what you're not allowed to wear, so let's say you wear a G-string underwear with ripped jeans, and you can see it, and they find this aghast, the school. The school decided to develop a uniform. So they wouldn't get expelled from school. They'd have to put on a uniform for the day. And humorously, they got one of the penitentiaries to develop the uniform, which has stripes horizontally across it. It's bizarre that the school actually thought that a deterrent for breaking the dress code would actually put them in basically like a prison uniform. And so, of course, there's been challenges to this, and it's been overruled. But the fact that a school would actually be dumb enough, frankly, to use this as kind of a deterrent for dress codes is just, it makes my life easier for good anecdotal stories in my research.
Dianne, this is Constance. You may have indicated the harbinger of the return of the dunce cap.
Yes. Yeah. It's a new version of it.
I would like. We've gone an hour and 40 minutes, and I have a sense that you have given us a lot to think of. Years ago, I heard the philosopher Susan Sontag address a group, and somebody said, well, what are the answers to the questions that you posed as we have asked you, like what's the next step or the next book? And she replied saying, my job as a philosopher is to find the questions to ask. So I think you've put the challenge before all of us is that as you've identified some of these issues in terms of cultural identity and the use of symbolic clothing, what do we do as educational leaders in order to allow the expression of various identities and not inhibit the freedom of others? Very interesting problems for us to grapple with. I would like to thank you so much. This has been absolutely outstanding in terms of your presentation.